I do think this is the most serious threat to European security since the end of the Cold War 23 years ago, and it's certainly the most important, difficult foreign policy challenge for President Obama. So yes, I do think there's going to be a response. It's not going to be military. It doesn't make any sense at all for the United States or NATO to confront Putin through military means because we're both nuclear weapons powers. That would be potentially catastrophic. So instead, I think President Obama, quite correctly, is going to try to isolate Putin, is going to try to galvanize international condemnation of what he's done. He's invaded another country in the 21st century. And I think that he's going to try to mount some economic sanctions and convince the Europeans and Americans together to restrict travel by certain Russian officials, economic sanctions that would drive up the cost to the Russian government for what they've done in violating international law. Now that's going to be difficult because Europe and the United States are going to have to be together. And right now, while many European countries do want an aggressive sanctions against Russia, Germany, the largest and most important, is holding back. So President Obama and Chancellor Angela Merkel need to close the gap between them. Well, that's the other thing that we've got to do here, not just sanction Russia, but support this new embattled government in Kiev. And Secretary of State John Kerry was there, and he extended a $1 billion loan guarantee offer from the United States. I think you'll see the European Union will also come forward with its own economic plan. And they need a lot of money. It's a bankrupt economy. There's a lot of corruption in the economy. It hasn't been reformed as significantly as it should have since the end of the Soviet period. And so they need to engage in market reform. And any turnaround of that economy will take years. So in addition to what the US and EU can do over the long term, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank can be very helpful. And if there's Western investment that can go in, that will be helpful. But this is a long-term project, but it's an important step that the US can take. It's somewhat similar. Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008 without pretext, just because Russia wants to keep certain countries in its orbit. And here's where I think it's similar. Russia wants to create influence beyond its borders. And it wants Armenia and Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine, specifically, countries that are not yet members of NATO and the EU, to stay in Russia's neighborhood. The Russians call it their near abroad, translated into English. And that means countries that Russia can dominate. And Ukraine has had, in Russian eyes, the temerity of wanting to seek closer trade relations with the European Union. Well, we Americans believe that Ukraine should have that right. And if Ukraine wants a democratic future, it should have that right. And so President Putin, in my judgment, takes a 20th century zero-sum attitude towards international politics. If Germany and the United States prosper, that must mean that Russia suffers. And that's an old way of looking at things. We're in a globalized 21st century. I know that, Harvard students know that. And President Putin ought to want a strong, vibrant Ukrainian economy on his borders, but he's not letting that happen. So I think we're the victim of a Russian leader who's acting like a 20th century, a mid-20th century Soviet leader.